Rain fell hard against the windshield of my car that night, November 15th, 2019. I remember because I checked the date twice, as if the day itself might change if I looked at it differently. The streetlights on Oakmont Drive cast their amber glow across the wet asphalt, and somewhere in the distance, the wail of a siren echoed through the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon. I didn't know then that siren was coming for my house. After 18 years of marriage to the man I thought I knew completely, my husband told me to leave our home. 3 hours later, a sheriff's deputy would arrive at our doorstep with papers that would change everything I understood about love, trust, and the life we'd built together. But this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about a plan so calculated, so methodical, that I nearly didn't survive it. This is the story of how one man tried to take everything from me, and how the truth, when it finally emerged, turned his own weapon against him. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 7 years trying to make sense of what happened that November night. Today, I'm telling you this story because it needs to be heard. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to All of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. When I first met David Mitchell, I was 24 years old, working as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm in Portland. He walked into my office on a Tuesday morning, representing a real estate development company that needed branding work. He was exactly the kind of man that made women feel like they'd made a terrible mistake marrying someone else. David had that combination of confidence and charm that seems almost scripted, like he'd studied how to be attractive the way other people study for exams. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair even then, and he had this way of making eye contact that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. I was engaged at the time, planning a wedding to a man named Tom, who worked in finance. But David changed all that in the span of 6 months. He called constantly, found reasons to visit my office, and told me things that made my heart race in ways Tom never had. Looking back now, I see it so clearly. David was hunting. He wasn't in love with me. He was in love with the idea of me, with the idea of control, with the idea of a life where he made all the decisions and someone else simply smiled and agreed. I broke my engagement with Tom, married David in a small ceremony at the courthouse, and moved into the beautiful house on Oakmont Drive that David had purchased 2 years before we met. He'd bought the house as an investment, he told me, but now it would be our home, our castle, our forever. I was so young, so naive, so completely unprepared for what forever would actually mean. The first few years were almost perfect. We traveled to Cancun, rented a cabin in the mountains, threw dinner parties where I'd cook for his colleagues and friends while he watched me from across the room with an expression I eventually learned to recognize as possessiveness masquerading as admiration. He loved me, he said. He loved me so much that he needed to know where I was at all times. He loved me so much that he preferred if I didn't work. He loved me so much that he slowly isolated me from my friends, my family, and eventually from myself. By year 5, I wasn't Sarah Mitchell anymore. I was David's wife. I was the woman who did what he wanted, who looked how he wanted, who thought what he wanted. I didn't have my own bank account. My name wasn't on any of our investments. My identity had been so thoroughly absorbed into his that I couldn't remember what it felt like to be just me. The house on Oakmont Drive was his, legally speaking. He'd made that clear from the beginning. I was a homemaker, an ornament, a possession as much as the furniture.
But I didn't see it that way then.
I saw myself as his partner, even though the partnership was entirely one-sided. I saw myself as lucky, even though I was being slowly erased. I saw myself as loved, even though love shouldn't make you feel like you're disappearing. By year 18, I'd become someone I barely recognized. My mother stopped calling as much because I was never available to take her calls. My friends had given up trying to include me in their lives because David would find reasons why I couldn't go out. My sister lived in California, and we drifted so far apart that Christmas cards were our only real connection. I existed in a space between being completely dependent and completely invisible. David controlled everything. He controlled our money, our schedule, our social life, and by extension, he controlled me. When he looked at me, I wasn't sure anymore if he saw a wife or an investment that wasn't performing the way he'd expected. November 15th started like any other day. I woke up, made breakfast, asked David how he wanted his eggs. He was reading something on his phone, something that made his jaw tighten in a way I'd learned to fear.
He didn't answer about the eggs.
He just kept scrolling, and then he set the phone down slowly, deliberately, like he was setting down a weapon he might need to pick back up again. "We need to talk," he said. Those words, in that tone, have probably ended more marriages than anything else in the English language. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, the one we'd bought together during year 3 of our marriage, back when he still sometimes let me choose things. My heart was pounding. I was already trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. That was my instinct by then. Whatever was about to happen, it was my fault. David took a breath, and when he started speaking, his voice was so calm it was almost worse than if he'd been angry. He said, "I don't think this is working anymore." He said, "I think you should leave." He said it the way you might tell someone that the milk in the fridge has expired. He said it like it was a practical matter, something that needed to be handled and disposed of, nothing more. I asked him if he meant for a day, for a week. I asked him if we needed to talk to a therapist. I asked him if something had happened, if there was someone else. He looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of pity and disgust, and he said, "You don't belong here anymore, Sarah. You need to leave. Now." It took me 4 hours to pack a suitcase. I'm not sure why it took so long. My entire life was supposed to fit in that suitcase, and yet I moved like I was moving through water, slow and heavy and disoriented. David sat in his study while I packed. He didn't help. He didn't try to convince me to stay. He didn't apologize or explain. He simply waited, and I simply packed, and the silence between us was so absolute that I could hear the rain starting to fall outside. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I left the house with a suitcase, $2,000 in my purse that I'd withdrawn from my account the week before, the account David didn't know about, the secret money I'd been saving for years because some part of me had always known this day might come, and absolutely no idea where I was going to sleep that night. I drove to a hotel near the airport, the Riverside Inn, a place I'd never been before. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to call my mother, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to hang up and dial 3 times before I could push the call button. When she answered, I told her what had happened, and she said something that I can still hear in my head, clear as if she said it 5 minutes ago. She said, "Oh, Sarah. What did you do?" Not what did he do. What did you do? That's how much David had convinced everyone that everything that went wrong in our marriage was somehow my fault. The next thing that happened was the knock on the door. I know I mentioned it at the beginning, but what I didn't tell you was how my heart completely stopped when I heard it. The knock came at 6 o'clock in the evening. I was sitting on the hotel bed, still in the same clothes I'd worn when I left the house, still holding my phone. For a moment, I thought it was David. I thought he'd come to tell me he'd made a mistake, that he wanted me to come home. That's what I hoped, even after 8 hours of being alone with my thoughts, knowing that this man had spent 18 years slowly destroying me. And that's the most heartbreaking part of the story, I think. Even after everything, I still wanted him to want me back. Even after everything, I still thought his love was worth having. Even after everything, I still believed that if I could just figure out what I'd done wrong, maybe I could fix it. I opened the door, and it wasn't David. It was a sheriff's deputy, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a badge that caught the light from the hallway. She had papers in her hand. She told me her name was Deputy Chun. She asked if I was Sarah Mitchell. When I said yes, she handed me the papers and told me that she needed to inform me that I was the legal owner of the house on Oakmont Drive. My name, she said, was on the deed. It had been on the deed since year 3 of our marriage. I looked at those papers, and the words just blurred together because I couldn't make sense of what I was reading. All this time, the house belonged to me. The whole time I thought I owned nothing, had nothing, was nothing but David's accessory. My name had been on the deed to the most valuable asset we had. David hadn't told me. He'd never told me. He'd let me believe that everything in my life was his, that I was dependent on him for shelter, that I should be grateful for the roof over my head, and all along, that roof was legally mine. Deputy Chen was still standing in my doorway, and she continued talking. She explained that David had filed papers that very day trying to evict me from the house I owned. He'd claimed I was a threat to him. He'd told the court that I was unstable, that I was dangerous, that I needed to be removed for his own safety. He'd done this all on the same day he told me to leave, while I was packing my suitcase, while I was trying to figure out my life. The deputy had come to serve him with a cease and desist order instead. She had come to tell him to get out of my house. She had come to tell him that he had no right to live there anymore, that he needed to leave within 72 hours or she would come back and escort him out. I stood there in the doorway of that cheap hotel room, holding papers that said I was worth something, that I had rights, that I had a home. And I absolutely fell apart. What happened next took me months to piece together, and even now, 7 years later, I'm still discovering new information. I hired a lawyer named Marcus Webb, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. Marcus helped me understand that David had been planning this for longer than I'd realized. He had strategically added my name to the deed during year 3, probably for tax purposes, probably because it looked better for his real estate business to be married. But then, as our marriage progressed and David became more paranoid about money, about control, about what I might do if I ever left him, he decided that he needed to remove me from the equation entirely. The problem was, he couldn't evict me from property I owned. So, he decided to force me out by making the situation so unbearable that I would simply leave on my own. He decided to gaslight me, isolate me, and convince me that I was nothing without him. And when that didn't work fast enough, when I didn't leave willingly, he decided to try something more aggressive. He would claim I was unstable. He would file a false restraining order. He would try to have me evicted and establish himself as the sole owner, and by the time I figured it out, it would be too late. But he made one mistake. He didn't realize that I had kept that secret bank account. He didn't realize that I had been seeing a therapist once a week for 2 years, telling her everything that was happening in my marriage. He didn't realize that that therapist would be willing to testify that I was not unstable, that I was a woman being systematically isolated and emotionally abused. He didn't realize that by the time he'd moved to evict me, I'd already begun the process of gathering evidence. He didn't realize that I was stronger than he'd convinced me I was. He didn't realize that the moment he tried to take away the one thing he couldn't control, my mind woke up from the fog it had been in for 18 years. Marcus helped me file a countersuit. Marcus helped me prove that David had been committing fraud, that he'd been using our marriage as a front for financial manipulation, that he'd been hiding assets and moving money into accounts I didn't know about. By the time the court case was over, in 2021, I had full ownership of the house. David had to pay me $800,000 in damages for fraud and emotional abuse. He had to move out of Portland entirely. And most importantly, I had to learn who I was again. The next 3 years were harder than the divorce itself. I had a house, I had money, I had my freedom back, but I didn't have myself. I didn't know who Sarah Mitchell was without David Mitchell attached to her like a shadow. I went to therapy 3 times a week for the first year. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping women who were in situations similar to the one I'd been in. I reconnected with my mother, my sister, my old friends. I learned to say no to people. I learned to say yes to myself. I painted every room in that house a different color, reclaiming each space as if I was literally repainting myself. I took a trip to Italy alone and sat in a cafe in Rome and cried because I could make that decision all by myself. I adopted a dog, a rescue pit bull named Olive who'd been abused like I had, and somehow having her depend on me, having a living thing trust me with her life, helped me start to trust myself again. And then about 2 years ago, I started getting messages from people. Women who were in marriages like mine. Women who recognized themselves in the stories I was starting to tell, first in my therapy group, then on social media, then to the women at the shelter. They told me their stories, and I realized that what happened to me wasn't unusual. It was heartbreakingly common. There are thousands of women out there, maybe millions, who are living exactly the life I lived. They're isolated, they're dependent, they're slowly being erased by someone who claims to love them. They don't have lawyers. They don't have secret bank accounts. They don't have anyone who believes them. So, I decided to start Olive Revenge Stories, this channel, as a way to tell these stories. To tell the stories that people like David don't want told. To tell the stories of women who survived. To tell the stories of truth correcting itself, of justice arriving even when you've stopped believing it would. The name Olive Revenge Stories comes from my dog, my Olive, who sits beside me while I record these videos, who rescued me by needing me. Not because I want revenge on David. I don't think about David anymore. I don't have time for him in my head. But because I want revenge on the silence. I want revenge on the shame that keeps women from telling their stories. I want revenge on the idea that if you leave someone who hurts you, you're the one who failed. I want revenge on every man who thinks that love means control and every woman who's been convinced that control means love. That's what Olive Revenge Stories is really about. David's story didn't end as neatly as I presented it. After he moved out of Portland, he started a new real estate business in Seattle. He married a woman 6 months after our divorce was finalized, a woman who looked a lot like me. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that he was already showing signs of repeating the same patterns. I wanted to reach out to her, to warn her, but I realized that she wouldn't listen. People in that situation can't listen until they're ready to. They have to go through it themselves. So I didn't reach out. I let her make her own choices, just like I had to make mine. What I did do was make sure that my story was out there, documented, real, so that maybe if she ever got to the point where she needed to understand what was happening to her, the information would be available. Years 6 and 7 were about rebuilding. I went back to school and got my master's in social work. I started a nonprofit that helps women exit abusive marriages, navigate the legal system. I wrote a book about my experience that sold more copies than I ever expected. I gave presentations at universities about recognizing the signs of coercive control. I became the woman I'd wanted to be in my 20s, the woman David had been trying to prevent me from becoming. I didn't become her despite what happened to me. I became her because of it. My suffering wasn't wasted. It became a map for other people. It became a warning. It became purpose. If you're still listening to this story, I want you to know something. If you're in a situation like I was, you don't have to stay. You don't have to be grateful for someone making you feel small. You don't have to pretend that control is love. You don't have to wait for someone else to save you. You can be the hero of your own story. I was. It took everything I had. It meant losing the life I thought I wanted. It meant proving myself wrong about what love means and what I deserve. But I did it. And if I can do it, so can you. That's what I want you to take away from this story. Not that I'm special. Not that I was stronger than other women. But that we're all stronger than we think we are, and we all deserve better than the situations we're trying to survive. If you're listening right now, I want to ask you something. Do you have a story like this? Have you survived something that the people around you told you to stay quiet about? Have you escaped from a situation that nearly destroyed you? If you have, please consider sharing it. Not because I want to exploit your pain, but because someone out there is listening to this channel right now, and they're seeing themselves in my story, and they need to know that they're not alone. They need to know that there's a way out. They need to know that the truth will eventually catch up with the lies. They need to know that they can be okay again. And every story like that, every woman who speaks up and says, "This happened to me and I survived," makes it a little bit easier for the next woman to do the same. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. Please share these videos with anyone who might need to hear them. Please help me prove that stories like this matter. Please help me show the world that silence is the ally of every predator and the enemy of every survivor. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of a community where women's stories finally get to be heard.